Hi everyone! I haven't made any videos about books before, but I've really been enjoying watching BookTube the last few months. I didn't realize that was a thing until recently, and I'm a classical musician who currently has a lot of time on her hands because of current events, so I thought it would be fun to try filming something talking about books. Fantasy is the genre that I've read the most of since I was a little kid even, and even before that I loved Greek mythology and King Arthur and Robin Hood and all of that stuff. But in my mind there is kind of a division between the books that I read when I was under the age of 15, and then I didn't read much fantasy for a couple of years, and then around when I went to college I started reading a bunch more fantasy again, and I think a lot of the books that I recommend and love today kind of date back to college or later. So there are a lot of series that I read when I was younger that I absolutely loved that I probably will never go back to, and I wanted to talk about some of those in this video. So there's an essay by the author Jo Walton where she talks about this idea called the suck fairy, which is basically the idea that the books that you used to love, now that they've been sitting on the shelf for all these years, the suck fairy comes along and inserts the suck. So now when you go back to them, that's why they're terrible and the writing's not good and the plot's contrived and all of those things. So it's sort of a cute explanation for why we sometimes don't like the books that we used to love, especially the books that we loved as kids when we had really active imaginations. So this video is sort of inspired by that concept, and I'm going to talk about 7 series that I used to love that I probably won't ever pick up or read again. And to be fair, I don't think that all of these series suck or that most of them suck, but I think a few of them do suck.
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear you. Could you please repeat what you said?
And to be fair, I don't think that all of these are series that suck. Some of them are actually quite good. It's just that for various reasons, I don't think I'm ever going to go back to them. The first series I want to mention is A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. Obviously, this is one of the most popular fantasy series maybe of all time, and I definitely would not say that it's a bad series. I just have kind of a complicated history with it. So when I first read it, I was around 13, I think. And the first 3 books were out and I absolutely loved it. It was way different than anything I had ever read up to that point in time. It was really dark, intense, and compelling, and I was just so sucked into it. And I hadn't read any fantasy like that before. And I know, even though the book came out less than 10 years before I was reading it, I think, but it hadn't been out for that long, and it really transformed the fantasy genre. I think A Feast for Crows came out in 2005 when I had already read the first 3 books, but remembered them pretty well and was still into the series, and that was the last book in the series I read. I haven't read book 5. So what happened for me with A Song of Ice and Fire is that the series started coming out when I was in college, and I was super, super excited for it. There hadn't been any big fantasy adaptations at that point of a lot of different series other than Lord of the Rings, which of course I loved, and streaming was not as widespread back then as it is today, so my only option was to wait until it came out on DVD to watch the first season, because I didn't have a TV or HBO or any of those things. So I got together with a friend with the DVDs. We were both really excited. We watched the first episode, and even from when Bran gets pushed out of that tower, I just had this sort of I can't do this feeling, and honestly the series was just kind of too intense for me to watch, and to this day I haven't watched the TV show past the first couple of episodes. A lot of my friends watch it, but yeah, so at that point it was just kind of too much for me, and I went back to reread the books a little after that, and honestly the books were too much for me too. I guess what was okay when I was 13 and had no empathy, I just found to be too much violence and rape and mutilation, and it was too gratuitous, and it just felt like it wasn't for me. One thing I still remember about reading the series because I have a really complicated relationship with spoilers, was that as a 13-year-old, I figured out pretty quickly that because all the chapters are named after the POV character of the chapter, if I was wondering if a character was dead or not that was a POV character, all I had to do was flip through the chapters in the rest of the book and see if their name ever came up again, and then I would know if they were dead or not. So after Ned Stark died, which hopefully that can't be a spoiler now, right? I mean, everyone knows that he dies. So I was looking through, and when I saw that his name didn't come up anymore as a point of view character, then I knew for sure he was dead. So that was a pretty serious moment in my life. So I didn't read A Dance of Dragons when it came out, and I don't think I'm ever going to reread or finish reading the series, but I have read all about it online and will probably continue reading the spoilers, so it's kind of just in the culture now anyway, so I guess I'll know how it ends, if it ends, but I don't think I'm ever going to go back to this series, and that's not because I don't think it's good, it just doesn't feel like it's for me anymore. The next series I want to talk about is The Heralds of Valdemar by Mercedes Lackey. I haven't really heard anyone talk about these books in a pretty long time, but I really loved them when I was a kid. It was one of the first fantasy series that I really got into. And I found the settings and the different magical creatures that she had and the plots to be really, really exciting, and they really captured my imagination. Looking back now, I can see a lot of the stories had to do with these basically telepathic magical white horses that were bonded to their riders, the heralds, and there were also a lot of characters that had basically soulmates that they were bonded to, and a lot of stuff like that I think just, I don't even want to see what the Sec Fairy has done there. I'm just going to leave it in my memory, and I think it's better if I don't ever revisit it. But I do want to say, despite the fact that I don't think I'm going to be reading any more of her books in the future, and I'm probably not going to reread any of the books that I loved when I was a kid, there's some really important things that I feel like I actually got out of her books that I do want to talk about. Mainly, she portrays a lot of same-sex relationships, and I think that was at a time where that was really not so common in books. And there's one series in particular where the main character is gay, and he deals with his homophobic family and heartbreak, and then he goes on to become like the most powerful mage in the world. And as an 8-year-old, I wasn't that interested in any relationships, really, like reading about them, and I don't think I totally understood the real world context to some of this, but I still think that reading about characters and situations like this from a young age really did help make me like a more empathetic and open-minded person, and I think that's true for a lot of the reading that I did when I was younger, and even to this day. I think reading books about characters with different experiences and perspectives is a way to help us understand those people. The next author I want to talk about is Robin Hobb, and this is another one I think is probably quite good quality, just not one I think I'll be revisiting. So her overall series is called The Realm of the Elderlings, and then all the different trilogies have their own titles. I never knew that it was called that until I looked it up for this video, but there you go. Her first book is called Assassin's Apprentice, and kind of like George R.R. Martin for me, her writing really changed what I thought fantasy could be. It was first person and kind of dark, and just the setting was really different than what I was used to, and she did a lot of really interesting things. Actually, as a kid, I almost didn't even pick up Assassin's Apprentice because I saw someone else reading it, and I looked at the copy on the back cover, and there were characters named things like Prince Chivalry and King Shrewd, and I thought it was some sort of like, I don't know, it just seems so fairy tale and stupid, but actually it's not at all. Those are just the royal family, and this series has sort of an interesting naming convention. So back in the day, I read a bunch of Robin Hobb. I read her first 3 trilogies. They were all really good. I think my favorite might have even been, I think the second one she wrote, the Live Ship trilogy, which is set mostly at sea, and there's just a ton of really cool concepts in there. I still think it's probably really good. But then what happened is I was in the middle of reading this other trilogy. She was publishing this in a different setting, and I just basically lost interest halfway through and just have never gone back to Robin Hobb since then. And sometimes when you leave something at a certain point, and it was like 15 years ago, it just feels like that's something in the past and you're not going to go back and revisit those characters and that setting. I don't know why that is for some books, because there are some books that I read that long ago that I still love and still read. But for me, even though I know she is still publishing, I think it's probably really good, but I just feel zero motivation to go read her books anymore. Next, I'll talk about David Eddings, an author that I really loved when I was a kid. I won't name a particular series because if you've read any David Eddings, you probably know all his series are basically the same thing with slight variations in setting. He always had a prophecy, a quest, a band of lovable characters. There's usually a thief, a knight, a wizard, and some sort of perky princess, or cute as a button girl that was actually bossing everyone around, and usually an earnest young man who is in love with her, and generally happily ever after. These were actually kind of a great introduction to fantasy at the time, even though the genre has moved on way past anything like this, and it was that sort of conventional, everything's broadly European and only the bad guys are more non-Western cultures and things like that you don't really see so much anymore. And they were sort of the sort of Roman culture and the sort of feudal culture and a lot of stuff like that. So I don't know if I would really even recommend these books for a younger reader, but I definitely have a soft spot for them in my memory. Next, I'm going to talk about two different series together because they are similar in certain ways, which is that they are both from D&D settings. So those books are the Dragonlance series by Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weiss, and then the Dark Elf series by R.A. Salvatore, which I'm pretty sure is still going, even though I think a bunch of the characters have died multiple times and come back to life by now. So aside from the similarity in that they're both from D&D campaign settings, I think what both these series did really well somehow was create these really compelling characters that I really cared about and felt kind of sucked into those character arcs, even though I didn't know anything about D&D. I've still never played D&D. Maybe my nephew will teach me at some point. But that aside, just somehow they created characters that were larger than the settings that they were in, and that as a reader, you just really cared about what happened to them. And even though I don't remember a lot about those books at this point, I still do remember those characters and some of the emotional points and things that they went through. So I think that's something that they did really well. That being said, I don't think I'm ever going to read any Dragonlance books or any books by R.A. Salvatore anymore. I don't think that's really where my interests lie these days. The last series I want to talk about is the Devery Cycle by Catherine Kerr. And I think I saw recently that she's going to be publishing more books in this setting, and that's what brought up the thought of making me think, would I want to go back and reread this series? Because I used to really like it. Is this something that I'd want to revisit? And the conclusion I came to had to be no. I don't think there's anything wrong with this series. It's not, I don't think it's a bad series, but it is a long series. I think there are, in the original cycle, maybe I think it's 3 trilogies and then a quartet, and it's in a Celtic-inspired fantasy setting. It's pretty cool, but it's all about the reincarnation of these different characters and the things that they go through in their different lives. And there are charts in the back of the book so you can track the names of different characters and different lives. And it can get kind of hard to follow, or at least it did when I was younger. Maybe it would be okay now. But even so, I also made the mistake at the time. I think the first book in this series that I ever read was I managed to accidentally buy at the bookstore the second book in the 3rd trilogy, and that was the first one I ever read, so that probably is why I was kind of confused at first. But I did manage to go back and read the books in the right order, and I feel like that's a problem that just doesn't happen as much anymore, because even if you're at the bookstore, you can always look stuff up on your phone and make sure you're not buying book 2 in a series. Although actually, when we visited Powell's, my husband did buy book 2 in a series by accident, so it's still a problem. But anyway, that being said, I think it's cool that she's going to write another book in this series, but even by the time the last few books in the last quartet were coming out, I had kind of lost steam on the whole thing, and just, I think I'm probably done with that. I honestly can't really say that I recommend any of these books anymore, even though I used to really love them. And some of that is just because most of them I haven't read in over 15 years. So my tastes have changed a lot. Even in the last few years, my tastes continue to change and evolve, and there are so many amazing books being written every year and a lot of great stuff that I can recommend. But I do have a soft spot for all the series that I talked about today. And even if I have my suspicions that maybe some of them have been visited by the Suck Fairy, I don't hate any of these series. These are all series that I really loved when I was younger, and they're always going to have a place in my heart. And I'm curious to know if there are any series that you guys loved when you were younger that you don't think you'll go back to revisit, or you just would be kind of scared to go back to see what you thought of them as an adult or anything like that. So let me know if there are and what those would be.